Good morning. We are in session 5 here in Panorama Plus 8. Plus 8 is the exile. And I'd like for you, if you would, to turn to page 95. We have some preparatory work somewhat by way of review, somewhat by way of setting context and setting the stage, if you will, for some of the revelations that will come in the book of Daniel. So you'll notice on this page, I've taken, with Panorama being 12 movements from Genesis to Revelation, I've kind of summarized movement 6, 7, and 8. Movement 6 was the united monarchy where we had 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. Saul was a Benjamite. Both David and Solomon were Judahites, and which is the ruling tribe, according to the prophetic blessing of Jacob in Genesis 49. So we have that. But with the death of Solomon in 931 BC, unfortunately, the kingdom split, and the northern tribes became known as Israel. The southern tribes became known as Judah. Now, I say the northern tribes are known as Israel. Sometimes Israel can mean all of them, north and south, and there's a little bit of confusion. You always have to check your context out and what have you. But nonetheless, the divided monarchy, the northern kingdom would last until they're taken away into Assyrian captivity. The southern kingdom would last until they're taken away into Babylonian captivity. And that is setting the stage for movement 8, the exile. Because in the exile, we are in Babylonian captivity. You'll notice I've listed the 3 prophets of the exile, Daniel, Ezekiel, and then also Jeremiah, who both prophesied before the exile as well as during and a little bit kind of afterwards as well. And you might want to circle Daniel, his name, because sessions 5 and 6 in our study this week and next week is built around a survey of the book of Daniel, which runs parallel to the teaching we've had on Sunday mornings. And I understand the teaching pastor threw me a little bit under the bus, but I'll get him for that later. All right, next page. Again, we have the timeline for movement 8. And it's a simple timeline in that there are 4 deportations. That's followed by what I would call the exile box, which addresses 3 theological questions. Number 1, how long is the exile going to be? Well, Jeremiah 25 and 29 prophetically said it would last 70 years. What are the empires during the captivity? Well, we start under Babylonian captivity. That makes sense. We're captured by the Babylonians, but they are then defeated by the Persians, and so we'll end up the 70 years under Persian rule. And then the prophets, which we've already noted, Ezekiel and Daniel primary, and then secondarily also Jeremiah. I added 2 important dates. Excuse me. 539 BC is when Cyrus, the Persian, or sometimes recalled Medo-Persian, but Cyrus captures Babylon. You might make a note to yourself that is described in Daniel 5, which we will look at with the handwriting on the wall and Belshazzar. Belshazzar was co-regent with his father Nabonidus. And Nabonidus didn't really want to be king. He preferred to go off on his own pursuits. And so he left his son to actually run the empire, which turned out to be not really a good idea at all because Belshazzar was ill-equipped for the task. But nonetheless, that's what happens. Also through the date in of 516, some would say it happened 515, but 515 or 16 is when the temple was rebuilt, finally under Zerubbabel and Ezra and the prophets Zechariah and Haggai urging the temple to be rebuilt. Now, what's important, and I double star point C here, I want us to walk through this diagram because it's very important in light of the prophecies that will occur next week, particularly chapters 10 to 12, but it'll also be chapter 2, also chapter 7, partly this week. Notice the diagram. you have an earthly kingdom on the left, and on the right, after all of this little box type deal, you have the millennial kingdom. In the earthly kingdom, we're going to be seeing Israel falls. In other words, they're captured by Syrians and then by Babylonians. So that's Israel fallen. But notice right there within the box, with the fall to Babylon in that first deportation, 605 BC, that begins what Jesus calls the time of the Gentiles. And it will last until the second coming of Christ to establish his millennial earthly kingdom. But the time between is the time of the Gentiles. That includes the church age. That includes we are living biblically, theologically, we are living in what is known as the time of the Gentiles. And I've given you two verses there. Let me just real quickly, wasn't planning on doing this, but we'll just go ahead and do it. Let me just read the Romans 11 passage. This is from Romans 11, verse 25. If you know anything about the book of Romans, the first 11 chapters are dealing with salvation by faith. Chapters 9 through 11 are dealing with what about Israel? And so this quotation is in the section of what about Israel? Paul's been talking about what it means to be saved. Well, what's going to happen to Israel? And so forth. All right, now Romans 11, where do I go? Verse 25. He says this, I do not want you to be ignorant of the mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has suffered a hardening in part until the full number of Gentiles have come in. In other words, we remain in the time of the Gentiles until this so-called full number has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. Now, that means Israel as a totality, as a nation. Not every individual within that nation will have personal faith, but it means, generally speaking, they will have a national repentance and they will put their faith in Christ, which was prophesied in Zechariah 14 as well. So we are, and you can look at Jesus' words in Luke 21, same idea, this time of the Gentiles. We are living within that period. And so when Israel is falling with the Babylonian captivity, Israel then will be restored once they come to national repentance and faith, which is described in the book of Revelation, and as well as Zechariah 14. So just keep that in mind. All right. Some of the prophecies that we're going to see of the coming kingdoms that will exercise dominion or authority over Israel is a further evidence of we're in the times of the Gentiles. Israel is not on the ascendancy. Israel has been conquered. And even when they have times of short times of Hebrew independence, we're still in the time of the Gentiles. All right? So let's turn the page. On page 97, I gave some information on the author. I won't go over that. Hopefully you'll have a chance to read it. I also gave some both historical, doctrinal, and Christological purposes for the writing of the book of Daniel. Under the doctrinal, I note that it prophetically chronicles the empires that would exert political control over the nation, starting with Babylon, followed by the Medo-Persians, followed by the Greeks, short time of Hebrew independence, and then the Romans. And Daniel is going to give us a prophetic overview of all of that. So that's why we're in the time of the Gentiles. That's why Daniel's prophecies are oriented in that way and limited to that subject. We'll also note another, you could put this as a sidebar, but another, I think, doctrinal emphasis in the book of Daniel is the centrality and the importance of prayer. You'll see Daniel openly praying, and at a time when no one could pray but to the king and so forth. We'll see Daniel praying and repenting on behalf of the nation as the intercessor and mediatorial prayer warrior for the nation. And as a result of that, Gabriel, the angel, comes with a message from God that gives an overview of when the Messiah is coming and so forth. Prayer is central. One author has said this: to the interested observer of Israel's fortunes in Daniel's time, it seemed that Yahweh had either become impotent or abandoned his chosen people. After all, they're in exile. So where's God? The gods of Assyria and Babylon had apparently triumphed over him. His temple lay in ruins. His capital had been ravaged, stood empty and vulnerable, and his people were living as unhappy captives in a foreign land. This, in a sense, sets the stage for the hearers of Daniel's message, the original hearers, but it also gives us a sense of context of what's going on. There are two significant revelations of Daniel. Number one, God is sovereign over human events and history. It may appear to us that history is out of control. And from a human perspective, certainly it appears we're careening like a runaway wagon down a hill. We're careening out of control. But Daniel is saying, no, God is orchestrating human affairs and human events. And then secondly, God is sovereign over the future. If you look at it from God's perspective, when the Psalms say that from everlasting to everlasting you are God, what it's saying is that God exists eternally in the past, eternally to the future, and everything in between, that God is the eternal now. And for him, he sees all of human history as one event for him. So prophesying or telling a prophet this is what's going to happen, no big deal for God. He sees it all, understands it all, knows it all, and the teaching of the Scripture is he's orchestrating it. And so that's another lesson we'll be looking at. All right, let's turn the page. Let's go to a chart. When in doubt, find a chart. There are actually two charts here, but each has a different point to make. You'll notice the first chart, on the left-hand side of the chart, chapters 1 to 6, we have 6 historical narratives. That's what we'll cover today. On the other side of the chart, we have 4 prophetic visions. Well, the truth is there's really more than 4, but nonetheless, if we're trying to capture it in a chart, there are 4 significant visions in chapters 7 to 12. And I think this morning, John Barclay was trying to cover 10 to 12. And whoever assigned him that, he ought to punch him in the nose. What a deal. But we have those 4 visions. Beneath that is a secondary chart, which I think in many ways is quite instructive. I want you to notice it from a language point of view. Chapter 1, which is an intro to the book of Daniel, chapter 1 is written in Hebrew. Beginning with chapter 2, a few verses into it, but beginning in chapter 2, I think around about verse 4, latter half of verse 4, the language changes to Aramaic. Aramaic was the common language of the ancient Near East. It was their trade language. Most everyone would speak it. They might have a dialect or a language of their own, but pretty much everyone spoke Aramaic. It's much like in the first century, everybody spoke Greek. It was the common language of the day. You might be a Jew living in Palestine and speaking Aramaic, but you would also know Greek, most likely. So we see chapters 2 to 7 is in Aramaic. Then, beginning with chapter 8 through chapter 12, we're back to Hebrew. So what's going on here? If Daniel, and I believe that he was the primary author, though others may have made some editorial, Holy Spirit-inspired editorial things going on, if Daniel wrote this, why switch languages? Well, I think it has to do with chapters 2 to 7. You'll notice it's the times of the Gentiles. In other words, we're going to get some prophecies related to the Gentile powers who are yet on the horizon with respect to Israel. And so we'll get these prophecies, and they're going to be written in the Gentile language, which of that day would have been Aramaic. When we get back to talking about what about the Jews and what's going to happen to the Jews, then we switch back to Hebrew. And so we have Hebrew from chapter 8 to 12. That may be the best explanation for the change in language. Let's go ahead and start our development of it. On the chart, our description of Daniel is our first chapter. And you'll notice in Daniel 1, verse 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, he was the 17th of the 19 kings of Judah. In the third year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. This begins the first of the 4 deportations. This begins the time of the Gentiles. All right? Turning the page. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim of Judah into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. Now, to reinforce the sovereignty of the conquering nation, they would often take religious artifacts out of the temple of the conquered peoples so that it showed, we're going to put this in our worship sanctuaries to show that our God is stronger than their God, because they got defeated and we won, so our God's stronger than their God. And so they would take articles of Jewish worship out of the Jewish temple and carry them off to Babylon. Remember that, because when we come to Daniel chapter 5, this will come back to play. These articles will come back into the story. This is all occurring in 605 BC. Let's look at the situation in the middle of the page, Daniel 1:3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites. Now, there's a whole lot of people being deported, but there's a small special group that are going to be selected for unusual purposes. In fact, it's described here in the text from the royal family and the nobility. So Daniel comes from a high-class Jewish family. In fact, there's speculation, maybe beyond speculation, good reason to believe that he was related to one of the former kings. And so nonetheless, he is of an aristocratic Jewish family. That would have meant he had good training. As a young Jewish man, he would have known the Hebrew Scriptures. He would have been trained by his parents. Deuteronomy says, parents, train your children in the law. And he apparently got very, very good training, because he will later cling to his Jewish upbringing and his instruction in the law, and he will not want to defile himself by eating unclean food. And so he's a remarkable individual. How old is Daniel? We don't know. But here's a good, reasonable explanation. About 15. So he's a quite remarkable guy. He's going to live well into his 80s. And so I'm gonna anchor around, say he's about 15 when he's taken into captivity, and he will enter into a 3-year intensive graduate school of Babylonian culture, Babylonian court systems, and language and customs and all of that. Why him? Because he is of an aristocratic family, and he has in some way, somehow, demonstrated superior ability. And why would the Babylonians want to invest into these Jewish youth? Because they can use them to run their vast empire, and they can train them the way that they want them trained, and they can basically rub the Jewishness off and replace it with Babylonian culture. At least that's the theory behind it all. So nonetheless, that's what's happening. Notice that there were some qualifications needed for being selected into this very unusual training program. They had to be young men, number one, without any physical defect. You cannot serve in the Babylonian court if you were in some way maimed. Let's say you're blind in one eye, or maybe you were crippled in one arm, or you'd had an accident and lost fingers or toes or whatever. In order to serve in the court, everything had to be just perfect, as well as your appearance. If you just didn't look very good, you weren't going to be given a shot. So not only is he bright, not only is he quite intelligent, he's probably a pretty good looking guy. So without any physical defect, number 2, handsome. Number 3, showing aptitude for every kind of learning. 4, well informed. 5, quick to understand. In other words, there's no remedial classes in this 3-year training program. Either if you can't get it quickly, you can't get it. So you've got to be pretty sharp. He's got to be 6, qualified to serve in the king's palace. So when they see him, went through their preliminary interviews and all of those kinds of things, we're preparing you for service before the king. And everything before the king, within the king's realm, within the king's court, has to be just so. And so these guys are being trained. Not only that, here's Ashpenaz's charge. He's got these selected individuals. Now, what's he supposed to do with them? Number 1, he's to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. This would be everything they need to know, not only for conversing, but they need to know the literature so that they can serve within the court in a proficient manner. He was to, secondly, teach them the language and literature. He was teaching language and literature. Secondly, they were to have a certain diet reserved for the king's court, for his table. Thirdly, they were to be trained for 3 years. And then fourth, after that, when they passed that training process, then they would be in the king's service. We're going to find out that that Daniel and his 3 friends are going to make it all the way through this training process. 1:7 at the bottom, Daniel's companions. By the way, their Jewish names are listed in verse 6. We always refer to them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We never think of them. That's their Babylonian names. But their Jewish names, Daniel, God is my judge, is what that means. Hananiah, Yahweh has shown grace. Mishael, who is like God, or what is God like, something like that. And Azariah, Yahweh has helped. So those are their Jewish names, which will then be changed. And we see that in verse 7. Let's turn the page. Early into this process, Daniel and his friends face a ceremonial and moral issue. And that is, the question is, will they compromise, because they're under Babylonian control, will they compromise their Jewish faith? Daniel 1, verse 1, verse 11, would they eat the king's food and drink, which would likely be, from a Jewish point of view, unclean? They're probably serving pork. Some of the food may have been offered to an idol. What was then after offered to the idol, brought to the king's table, those kinds of things. So what will Daniel and his young friends do? And here we're going to see the hidden hand of God. Verse 11, Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Here's a creative alternative being suggested by Daniel in a very wise and understanding way. I mean, this is amazing for a guy 15 or so years old. Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then compare our appearance with those of the young men who are eating from the king's table. And then, based on what you see, you do the right thing. It's an amazing amount of faith as well as discernment and insight. So the guard agreed to this, which tells you that, that Daniel had in some way impressed this guard, because why would a guard just, some Hebrew youth comes up and says, hey, would you just give us vegetables? And no, he's probably had some interaction with this guard and has impressed him in some way so that he would agree to do it. And so the guard tests him for 10 days. And at the end of the test, Daniel looks better and his friends look healthier than the others who were eating the king's table. That is the hand of God. He is ensuring that they are keeping themselves ceremonially clean as well as physically fit in the eyes of the guard. So that's their first test of their conscience. They will have others. They're coming on the further into the book. Daniel 1:17 is at the top of page 101. To these four young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. In other words, they did quite well academically. They're really top students. And they entered the king's service as administrators. So don't think that just because they're having to learn the culture and the language of Babylon, that they're also buying into astrology, and they're buying into divining the future. They're, communicating with the dead, which many of their quote, quote, wise men would do. They understand it, but they don't necessarily practice it. Does that make sense? So based on what we know from them already, they wouldn't have bought in to everything they had learned, but they've learned it. And now they're capable of being administrators within the king's court. Now that brings us to chapter 2, and we're introduced to Nebuchadnezzar. We're now changing our language from Hebrew now into Aramaic. And you'll notice there's at the bottom of the page, I have a little chart there. This is what's known as a chiasm, or chiasm, if you prefer. And what a chiastic structure does is it parallels ideas such that A and A prime are related. Then you indent to B, concept B, and then B prime is at the bottom. And then it kind of makes half of the letter, looks like half the letter X. If you know what the letter chi or chi looks like in Greek, it looks like an X. So if you just take that half of the X, that's the basic structure of ABC, C prime, B prime, A prime. So that's why they call it chiastic structure. It's an evidence of the literary strategy of the writer, that he has a compositional strategy in the way he has arranged his material. And so let's follow that. The first thing is, chapter 2, we're going to see a prophecy concerning Gentile nations. It'll be in the form of a statue with a head of gold, and then we work our way down other precious metals and so forth. But we'll have a prophecy concerning Gentile nations. That's Nebuchadnezzar's statue and the four nations that were on the horizon for conquest of Israel or of Judah. Then at the bottom, A prime, we'll have another prophecy concerning Gentile nations. This will be a dream of four beasts, and that'll be very compatible, very similar to the statue. Same message, if you will. So A and A prime are related. Prophecies concerning Gentile nations. We're in the times of the Gentiles. We're in the Aramaic language, the Gentile language. B, supernatural persecution and deliverance. Chapter 3 is the fiery furnace. Do you remember Daniel's three friends tossed into the fiery furnace? They see a fourth figure, and we'll get to that in a moment. Look at B prime at the bottom. Another supernatural persecution and deliverance. This is when Daniel is tossed into the lion's den. And this is under the Persian king. And we'll see that when we get there. Point C and C prime, God's revelation to a Gentile king. That's Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the tree that's cut down. And then C prime, God's revelation to a Gentile king, chapter 5. That's the handwriting on the wall. So you see the thematic parallelism of ideas. It's the compositional strategy that Daniel uses to advance his message. So don't think of Daniel as you just said, well, I think I'll just sit down at his desk and just start writing. There's a great amount of thought, not to mention Holy Spirit leadership, in composing this book that we call Daniel. Let's turn the page. Nebuchadnezzar's going to have a dream. And the dream, with Daniel's interpretation, will give us the broadest sweep of prophetic future of any of the Hebrew prophets. This is going to be a massive sweep of human history. So let's begin it with chapter 2. In the second year of his reign, which would be in about 602 BC. You have to understand the way they would reckon times for kings' reigns. They had to have, you came in at a partial year, then you had to have an accession year, and then you had to have your first full reign. So they do some strange things in their accounting. But you can just note, around 602 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. Dreams. And his mind was two things. He was troubled, and secondly, he couldn't sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, all of the wise men who've been trained in the arts and the lore of Babylonian, not only culture, how to tell the significance of dreams and all of those kinds of things. He brings them all in. And when they came in, he said to them, I had a dream, and I want to know what it means. Well, they said, great, king, that's what we're here for. So tell us what you dreamed. And the king says, no, I want you to tell me what I dreamed. Now, why would he do that? Because whatever he said, this is what I dreamed. Oh, yeah, well, let's tell you, king, this is what it meant. He doesn't trust them. He thinks they're going to be, how do you say it nicely? They're going to be covering their rear. They're going to be covering their rear. And so consequently, Nebuchadnezzar says, no, you tell me what I dreamed. And the wise men said, well, nobody can do that. That's not possible. Now we pick up the story in chapter 2, verse 8. Then the king answered, I'm certain you're trying to gain time, because you realize this is what I've firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there's only one penalty for you. In other words, the king is hot under the collar, so to speak. You've conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So now, I say it again. Tell me the dream, and then I'll know you could do a good interpretation. Well, they cry out, there's nobody on earth can do this. And so enraged, the king says, all right, I want to clear the court of all of these wise men. I want them all executed and put to death. It was not uncommon in the ancient Near East for kings to overreact. This is just a bit of an overreaction. Everybody dies because of this. Well, this would have included Daniel and his friends. And so when Daniel hears from Arioch, the chief commander of the king's guard, he asked him to intercede on his behalf, and he sought permission from the king, asked the king, give me some time, and I think we can work this thing out. And so Daniel has time. He goes back and he organizes a prayer meeting. Remember the centrality of prayer? He organizes a prayer meeting with his three friends and himself, and they pray that God will intervene. So finally, Daniel goes before the king. And when he goes before the king, the first thing he does is he gives a disclaimer. Notice at the top of 103. Daniel 2:26. The king asked Daniel, also called his Babylonian name Belteshazzar, are you able to tell me the dream I saw in my dream and interpret it? And Daniel replied, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he's asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries just like your dream. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar, and I would bracket this, what will happen in days to come. This dream is prophetic. It is a prophetic future dream. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you were lying in bed are these. And then he begins to tell him what he saw. Perhaps you have in times past seen pictures or artist illustrations of what the statue looked like. I've captured that in a chart here, but I want you to add a little bit to it because I ran out of room on the chart. But basically, what you'll notice is in dark print, here's the statue. It has a head. It has distinct chest and arms. It has distinct abdomen and thighs, distinct lower legs, distinct feet and toes. That's the statue. Next to head, on the left-hand side, write Babylon, because the head of gold represents King Nebuchadnezzar and his rule over the expansive Babylonian Empire, which was quite expansive. Next, the chest and arms speaks of the Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great in particular. The Persian Empire. Notice we move from gold to silver, from the most valuable to less valuable, from a soft metal to a harder metal. There's a symmetry in all of this, but I'll let you look at those later. We're just interested in the statue. The abdomen and thighs is Greece. Primary figure there would be Alexander the Great, who will be prophetically described a little bit later. Lower legs is Rome. Now, the Roman Empire lasted from 31 BC to about 476 AD. The Eastern Empire lasted even longer, into the 1400s. You realize there was a split between the West and the East. The East is now like Greek Orthodox, or the Orthodox, and the West would be the Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire, the Catholic Empire. So consequently, lower legs is Rome. The feet and toes, trust me for this, I'll try to give a little more explanation later, but I'm calling that Rome too. It's not Rome, the historical Rome that we see coming on the horizon that will capture Palestine, and Jesus will be born under Roman Empire control. But this is a second Roman-like empire that's yet in the future. And we believe it's far into the future, so much so that it's in the future from our day. Some call it the revised Roman Empire. I just prefer to call it Rome II, only in the sense that it'll have some of the characteristics of the Roman Empire, but it'll be a different ballgame. It'll be a global, different ballgame. All right? Just trust me on that. Let's go. Next page. Daniel 2. In the time of those kings, in the far future, in the last days, the God of heaven will set up another kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will be left to another people. Now, we're talking about literal empires, literal Persia, literal Greece, literal Rome. This empire, this kingdom is a literal kingdom, but it's a kingdom that God will set up. And it's what we would call the Messianic kingdom, or the millennial kingdom, or the Davidic kingdom. All are synonymous, mean the same thing. God will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, and so forth. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. In other words, this kingdom will supersede all other kingdoms. The ones mentioned on the chart, this kingdom will be the ultimate kingdom. It is described by the Hebrew prophets as a time of unparalleled blessing, a time of justice, a time of equity, a time of economic prosperity, a time of peace. In fact, if you wanted to describe the millennial kingdom, you could describe it in a Hebrew word, shalom. Shalom. Now, you know what the word shalom means, right? Peace. But we're not talking about just peace in the sense of absence of conflict. Hebrew concept of shalom is, may all that happens, may everything be as it ought to be. May the world run the way that it ought to run. And when Jesus reigns from Mount Zion, from Jerusalem, in the millennial kingdom, trust me, things are going to run the way they ought to. We're not going to have a problem with bureaucracy, because we'll be the bureaucrats. And so we're not going to have a problem with bureaucracy at that point. Things will be as they should. All that this portion, this scripture is telling us is that God has a kingdom, and the rock is a symbol of Christ in this sense, and that it's cut out of a mountain, which would be God, not by human hands, a rock that breaks the other kingdoms. So, what happens then? Nebuchadnezzar falls down before Daniel and tries to exalt Daniel, and that's probably inappropriate. The king exalts Daniel's God as the God above all gods. That is appropriate. And the king promoted Daniel to high administrative position and his friends to lesser post. So Daniel is on fast track. I mean, you talk about climbing the corporate ladder. He has just leapfrogged a bunch of other Babylonian officials and administrators. Which, by the way, do you think there's any jealousy when you get that sort of thing happening. this, this young man is being promoted above some of us. All right, chapter 3, we come to the story of the three young men. Sometime later, likely several years later, Nebuchadnezzar constructed a big golden image. Now, it may be in part because of the dream that he had, but it may also be, there may also have been a political reason for it. I quote Dyer, an Old Testament scholar, who notes that at 595, 594, there was a failed coup attempt against Nebuchadnezzar. And so this new statue may be a test of loyalty as much as it is a religious exaltation of Nebuchadnezzar as king. If so, then this is a required test of loyalty. We pick up the story in verse 4. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound, now this is going to be the cause, it's going to require an effect, but here's the cause. When you hear the sound of the musical instruments, you must fall down and worship the image. That's the effect. You hear the sound of the music, then you fall down and worship the image that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. That's the motivator. You know, you don't do it, you're thrown into the fire. Therefore, verse 7, as soon as the people heard the sound of the musical instruments, everyone fell down and worshiped the image, just the way it was supposed to be. But the problem is, Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, did not bow the knee to the image. Now, these are the same three guys that in Daniel 1, along with Daniel, refused to compromise themselves by defiling themselves by eating the king's food. So that early test in Daniel 1 has now led to a greater test, a more difficult test, but you pass the first one and you continue to grow and develop and mature, you then are able to pass the second test. And that's the way God grows us. And if you don't believe it, put a side note, James 1, 2-4, that consider that the testing of your faith is to produce endurance and maturity and those kinds of things. All right, Daniel 3, verse 13. So what's the effect on the king in light of the three Hebrew youths who, well, they're young men by now. They're in their probably 20s. What's the effect on Nebuchadnezzar? Well, furious with rage. Why rage? Well, this is a personal insult. It's a political defiance. And it's also administrative insubordination because they work for him. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're brought before the king. And he said to them, is it true? Is it true what I've heard that you did not bow the knee? And they basically said yes. And their reply to the king in their second test of integrity, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, verse 16, replied, King Nebuchadnezzar, now notice the number of we's. This is solidarity. We do not need to defend ourselves before you. In other words, King, you should know by now of our loyalty to you, but but also our loyalty to our God. You should know by now. 17, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. He's not obligated to, but he is able to. He's able to deliver us, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the image. Would you say that's bold? I mean, that's pretty bold. Strong words. What we note is their confidence is in God's power. He's able to deliver us. And they're also note their commitment to God's will. We will not serve your gods, whether we are delivered or not. We will go to the death. In other words, we will allow you to martyr us for our faith, if that's what it comes to. So, Nebuchadnezzar, if he was mad before, now he's really hacked off. So he says, all right, stoke the fire 7 times hotter. I want that thing so hot that it incinerates those 3 rebellious youths. So they throw them into the fire. But oddly, there were no screams of agony. Chapter 3, verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, didn't we throw 3 men in? But look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th one looks literally like a son of the gods. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is not saying, oh, that's the pre-incarnate Christ. That's beyond his thinking. What he's saying is, I see what looks like to be a divine figure in there. However he worked that through his theology, we don't know. But he acknowledges this is something that has the touch of divine with it. Now, our question is, who's that 4th person? And there are only 2 real options. It's either an angel sent on assignment, go down and take care of the 3, or it is the pre-incarnate Christ. Pre-incarnate is the way we describe Jesus before Bethlehem. He has always existed. He was present at creation. He's the 2nd member of the triune Godhead. He didn't just come into existence at Bethlehem. That's only when he took on human flesh. But he's always existed. And we have many occasions where the angel of the Lord, the pre-incarnate Christ, appears in the Old Testament and will often accept worship and will often speak with the authority of God. So you can make your choice. It was an angel on assignment or it was the pre-incarnate Jesus. That's up to you, pre-incarnate Christ. Let's turn the page. So after this, and they bring him out, Nebuchadnezzar then says, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel. Now, the word angel in Hebrew, melech, means messenger. The word angelos in Greek means messenger. And it can be a human messenger or it can be a divine messenger. Context rules. So here, really all he's saying is God sent a messenger, and I think it had a divine element to it, so angel is a good translation. Though whether or not Nebuchadnezzar believed in angels the way that the Hebrews believed in angels, I don't know. I would say not. But nonetheless, a messenger who rescued. Verse 29, he makes a decree. Any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they'll be cut to pieces and their houses turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. And then the 3 Hebrew youths get another promotion. So they're moving up the ladder along with Daniel. All right, now we come to chapter 4. And now we have the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. There are no historical markers, so we don't know when this occurred, but most likely this is near the end of his 43-year reign. We just don't know precisely when it happened, but it happened much later in his reign. He starts out. You'll notice in the first paragraph there, I've got another small doxology. Do you see it? The A and the B prime and A prime. All right, it's a real simple one. The chapter is structured with a doxology on the front end and a doxology on the back end. In the middle, there's a dream that's related, and then there's a dream that's interpreted. That's a real simple chiastic structure. Even I could have seen that one. So we'll bypass his doxology, Daniel 4, 2-3, but he's extolling the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He calls him the Most High God. In Hebrew, that would be El Elyon. He's talking about him. And then we come to the dream. And in the dream, it's a disturbing dream. And so Daniel is summoned, who is the chief dream interpreter. And this is what he said. Here's the top of the next page, 107. He says, in my vision, in my dream, this is Nebuchadnezzar talking, I looked and there was before me a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven. And he called out in a loud voice. He said, do 4 things. Cut down the tree. Okay. Trim off the branches of the tree. Strip off the leaves. Scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground in the grass of the field. Now, beginning here, it says, instead of a root or a stump, let him, the stump, which we will find out is Nebuchadnezzar, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 somethings pass. 7 months, 7 years, 7 days. It's non-specific. Because Daniel uses this word Shabuah several times later, I take it to be 7 years. So I think King Nebuchadnezzar is, the whole point of the dream is he was really full of himself and very full. He was at a time of no warfare, and he's sitting in his palace and he's reflecting on how great his kingdom is and how great he as king is. And then God gives him a dream to bring him down to earth. And in this dream, it says he'll have a period in his life for 7 years where he'll be like a madman. And he'll go around like an animal. His fingernails will grow out. He'll eat grass. He will just absolutely go bonkers. And so Daniel, beginning with Daniel 4, verse 20, and you can read that later, but Daniel now interprets the dream and says, this is what's going to happen. And he basically in that says, King, when you come to a point where your humiliation is finally over, then you will personally repent and you'll acknowledge the God in heaven. The question here, in the times of the Gentiles, as great as these empires are going to be, as great as the Babylonian Empire is, it'll be conquered by the Persians. As great as their empire is, they will be conquered by the Greeks. As great as their empire is, they'll be conquered by the Romans. And the idea is God is above all of that. God is orchestrating the movement of human history and the rise and fall of kingdoms and powers. And so Daniel interprets it and says in verse 22 of Daniel 4, Your Majesty, you are that tree. You've become great and strong. Your greatness has grown till it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. Your Majesty saw a holy one, saying, cut down the tree, but leave the stump. And he goes on to talk about, and let him be drenched with dew and crawl around like an animal and all of that. Next page, verse 24. This is the interpretation, Your Majesty, and this is the decree. You will be, 1, driven away from people. 2, you'll live with wild animals. 3, you'll eat grass like the ox. And 4, you'll be drenched with the dew of heaven. And this will occur until 7 times pass by, until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. All right, now for a moment. Think, you are a Jew, and you realize we were defeated by the great Babylonian Empire, and we are under the thumb of the Babylonian Empire. And Nebuchadnezzar has had a long reign, and he's had building projects, and he has beautified the city, and he's done the hanging gardens and all of that, and he's rebuffed all of these would-be conquerors, and he has extended the reaches of the empire. And I'm just a Jew, and I'm in captivity. And now suddenly I realize that the God I serve is the God who has just humbled the greatest man on the earth. And basically the teaching is that God is in control, not Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar may think he's a big deal, but he was humbled for 7 years until he acknowledged the greatness of God. Now, at the end, at the bottom of page 108, there's our closing doxology where Nebuchadnezzar, now in his right mind, begins to exalt God. So he starts out saying, I exalt the Lord of heavens. Now let me tell you about the sad story that where my hubris and my pride led me to being judged by God to be acting like an animal. But then my mind was restored when I acknowledged the Lord God, and therefore I praise him again. So that's the end of chapter 4. This raises an important question, and it's found on the next page. And we really don't have time to go into it because we're almost out of our time. But that was Nebuchadnezzar an Old Testament believer? And I'll let you read. It's in the box there on the top of page 1. I'll let you read what Dr. Dyer says, or at least suggest that based on the development of the stories of how God intervenes in his life, was he an Old Testament believer? I just simply say at the bottom of the discussion, what do you think? I know what I think, but I'm curious what you think. And I'm not telling what I think. All right, let's look at chapter 5, the dinner of Belshazzar. Much later in Daniel's life was the drunken feast of Belshazzar. This is the end of the Babylonian domination of the Jews. This is the night where the Babylonians fall to the Persians. And so Belshazzar, bottom of the page, Belshazzar gives a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drink wine with them. There are historical records that there were times when they would have feasts and have as many as 15,000 people in attendance. Don't ask me how they did that. I guess they went to the local Razorback Stadium and arranged something. But nonetheless, these huge, lavish, very expensive feasts, which gives you a sense of how wealthy and how prosperous their kingdoms were. And so Belshazzar, who is not a very good king, he's a co-regent with his father, Nabonidus, he gives this great feast, and they're drinking wine. And on top of the next page, he gives orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, technically his grandfather, but that's a way of saying his descendant, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. Remember, all the way back in Daniel 1, in 605, when Daniel was taken into the first deportation, they took some of the articles out of the temple and they stored them in Babylon. Well, now Belshazzar, he's really feeling no pain, and he's a little bit high, and he says, "Hey, let's bring in all of those religious artifacts that my grandfather took out of Jerusalem." Now, what do you think? How do you think God takes that? Now they're desecrating a holy artifact used in a holy temple where the only true God dwelt within that temple. And so he says, bring them on out. So they drank wine from it so that his nobles, wives, and concubines could drink from them. And as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver. Now, historically, while this banquet is going on, the Medo-Persians have encircled Babylon. Babylon as a city has not fallen for 1,000 years. Belshazzar believes in this double wall around Babylon that is an impregnable fortress, and there is no way anyone can scale the heights of the wall. And even if they did, then there's another wall right on the other side of it with all of our archers and whatever on the ramparts, just absolutely destroying any army crazy enough to try to get in. But the Persians were pretty smart because the river Euphrates flowed into the city, and so they diverted the river. When the water went down, then they went underneath the gated area where the water flowed through. Then they were able to scale the walls because nobody was really they weren't on alert like they should have been. And then they actually began to take the city. In fact, they were probably taking the city while the banquet's still going on, not even realizing their moments were numbered. I even quote the Psalm 135 near the bottom of the page. The idols of the nations are silver and gold made by human hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see, ears but cannot hear, nor is there breath in their mouths. Those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. And so their trust in their gods, now drinking out of the religious artifacts of the Jews. Persian army is now working its way in. And during the middle of this revelation, they're having a drunken party, and right there on the wall, a hand appears, and it begins to write Aramaic words. And so the king, who is so terrified, he summons all of his wise men, and they can't read the writing. Well, actually, they can read it. It's in a language they know. They don't understand it. They can't tell the significance of it. It's not a sentence. Belshazzar, your days are numbered. It's not that clear. It's just words. 3 words pop up. And so they can't tell the king what it means. And the text says in verse 9, King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale, and his nobles were baffled. But talk about understatement. I mean, you've got a supernatural hand writing stuff on a wall. Yeah, I guess folks are baffled. Then Daniel, the queen mother finds out that this has happened, and she said, look, I remember there's this Daniel. He's in his 80s now, but there's this Daniel guy. He could interpret dreams and things. So they bring Daniel in. Belshazzar probably doesn't even know Daniel. Daniel may be, for the most part, retired from administrative service. And so they bring him in. Verse 12, this Daniel was found to have a keen mind, knowledge, understanding, ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, solve difficult problems. Call him in. So they called him in. And what does Daniel have to say? It's at the bottom of the page. But you did not honor the God who holds your life in his hands. Therefore, he sent the hand. And what did it say? Many, many tekel upharsin. And basically what that means is, next page, top of 112, many, God is numbered. The word many has the idea of numbered. Numbered the days of your life. Tekel is, we get a word shekel. They're loan words with one another, is a weight or a measure of generally of money or other things. But tekel, you've been weighed, and Perez, your kingdom is divided. It's the word divided, or a form of the word divided. So basically, the 3 words are saying this is it's over. Judgment is fallen. You're losing your kingdom. You're losing your life this very night. And the Daniel 5:30 says that very night, Belshazzar was slain. The last one, beginning with F, you might put a side note next to F. Now we're under Persian rule. So with Belshazzar's death and the capturing of Babylon, the Persians have now defeated the Babylonians. And Daniel and the captives from Judah are now under Persian rule. And so this chapter 6, occurs sometime later. And I have for you on the top of 113 a little, another chiastic structure. It's very, very well done. I think you're familiar with the story. Daniel is probably, even in his 80s, is now brought out of retirement, if in fact he has been in retirement. He is acknowledged to have superior administrative leadership abilities, and the Persians, who had a policy of using captured peoples in their own kingdom to accomplish administrative functions, Daniel has so won the admiration and respect of his Persian leaders that they place him in a high administrative role or high administrative position. That did not go well with the Persian leaders, who were bypassed, and said Daniel is going to be one of 3 leaders over the whole empire, and there was contemplation that he was going to be in charge of the 3 leaders. So the palace intrigue, the hatred for Daniel then leads all of those overlooked administrators who had their eyes on high administrative positions. They then concocted a plan that king, write a decree that which cannot be repealed, but write a royal decree that says that anybody who prays to any god or who does not pray to your God, but prays to any other god except you, O king, they are to be thrown in the lion's den. They are to be killed. And the king, when they came, they said, we've all consulted, all of us. I don't think Daniel was consulted, but that's what they said. We've all been consulted, and we're going to lay this edict before you. And the king says, yeah, okay, I'll sign it. Now, here's something you got to know about Persian edicts. In Babylon, a king could issue an edict, and then he could change his mind and redo it. In Persia, their law was once the king made an edict, even the king himself could not change it. And so when he agreed to this, and then finds out that Daniel, one of his favored administrators, has refused to pray to the king's God or to pray to him, then he does what he can, as best he can. He does what he can to get Daniel out of this fix, but he cannot change the edict. And so finally, he goes to bed that night after they toss Daniel into the lion's den. He goes to bed that night. He can't sleep because he really doesn't want to put Daniel to death. But that was the law. This is the way. Yeah, very few of you even understand what that means. That's from The Mandalorian, but we'll let it pass. This is the law. This is the way that things are done. And so the next morning he comes and he says, Daniel, are you in there? Did your God save you? And Daniel said, yes. And so the king then issued an edict that the people who falsely accused Daniel, they get killed and so forth. And so you have this really harsh turn of lex talionis, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You know, whatever they try to do to you, you're not going to do to them. It's a real harsh policy, but that's the way it was in ancient times. From our vantage point, we might question it, but we're not living in those days. We're not living in the 6th century BC. So if you'll look on the bottom of page 115.8, Daniel 6:28. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. The final pages, I've taken each chapter and given you some practical ideas. So I hope that you'll have a chance to go back and read those. Phew. That is a quick overview of Daniel 1 to 6. We will do 7 to 12 next time. All right? And there's a lot of interesting, intricate, detailed prophecy, and we'll do the best we can to open that up. All right? God bless you. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.
Robert?
Yes, sir.
Why don't you think Daniel was thrown into the fiery furnace?
Possibly he's away on assignment and was not there. Possibly his high administrative role, it did not apply to him. But I tend to think the first possibility is probably most accurate, is that in the high role that he had, he might often had to travel out to the various districts on behalf of the king and so forth, and was probably not there at that time. Yeah.